great pleasure for me to introduce Marco Marini. He's actually a former student of mine. He took his undergrad studies in Bocconi University, then he went to the UK to do his master, and he stayed there. And now he's working as a strategy analyst at Ofcom, which is the regulation authority in the UK. He has lots of things to say, so without further ado, I think the word to him, and please feel free to make comments, questions, suggestions. Come on.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. As Nicoletta said, a few years ago I used to sit behind those desks, and Nicoletta used to teach me about the wonders of microeconomics, utility curves, production functions, and all that. Now I work at Ofcom, which is, as Nicoletta said, the communications authority in the UK. I'm going to talk a bit about what Ofcom does, and then I'm going to focus on broadband. What is broadband, how broadband markets have evolved, and what's the role of regulation in broadband. I know you don't tend to focus on regulation in this course, so I hope it will be interesting. If it's not, just let me know. I'm going to skip over it. It can be a bit dry. I'll try and make it interesting, but we'll see. We'll see whether it works. Today, I'm not representing Ofcom. This is because I didn't obtain all the necessary authorization to represent my employer. And it's also a way to make things a bit more interesting. I can say more things, perhaps criticize Ofcom a little bit as well. So I think it's better this way. So I'm speaking in personal capacity, and I'm going to explain some of Ofcom's official positions. I'm going to be talking about the UK market, because it's the market I know best. But I'm also making some references to international markets and some comparisons of different regulatory approaches across countries. Feel free to interrupt at any time. If I go too fast or too slow, just let me know. Don't worry about that. So, okay, contents of today, quite a few slides for you. They're all going to be, there's going to be one question on each in your exam, I'm sure. No, that's not true. So I'm going to talk about what Ofcom does. I'm going to talk about broadband, the evolution of broadband up until now, the role of regulation for broadband, why do we regulate broadband, and what are the benefits of regulating it. Then what's coming next for broadband, what we tend to call superfast broadband, which is not just faster but better in many other ways, and how should we change regulation to encourage investment and to strengthen competition as we move to a different kind of broadband. Then, if we have time, we're going to talk about what happens to broadband services in a recession. Do consumers give it up? Do they like it? Do they want to spend less? What happens with that? We've got some data to show you, and just a summary in the end. So Ofcom is an independent regulator with responsibilities across radio, TV, telecoms, and spectrum. It was created in 2003 with an act of law. This is why it's a so-called statutory corporation. So we're not part of the UK government. We're independent from it. But, you know, money is coming from government. Part of the money is coming from the government. So the relationship with government is evolving over time, and our areas of influence can change, although we have a number of duties that define what we have to do. The key duties of Ofcom, the reason why we're there, is to further the interest of citizens and consumers in relation to communications issues. The distinction between these two is quite important. I mean, one could say citizens, we all are citizens and consumers at the same time, but this refers to, what the term consumers refers to the economic sphere. So are prices affordable, are services available, and stuff like that. The idea of promoting the interest of citizens as well indicates socio-economic implications of communication services. So Ofcom is a bit different. It's not just purely an economic regulator. It's not just regulating for competition. It's also regulating to further public interest in the sector. We're doing lots of stuff, around 270 duties coming from different pieces of legislation. The Communications Act is the main reference for us, but there's also European legislation which defines what we do. Telecoms regulation especially is mostly defined and influenced by what's decided by the European Commission and the European Parliament, more than UK-based institutions. Ofcom was created in 2003 and replaced a number of bodies that were there before us. There was one on telecoms, two on TV, one on radio, and one on radio communication, so management of spectrum. Why do you think they've done that? What's the key reason for putting all the communication services and regulation of them under one roof? Coherence, yeah. Why would you need coherence across these services? Why not water and energy, for example? Okay, yeah. Yeah. And what happened to communications over the last few years? What's been the impact of the internet? Any idea? Exactly, convergence. Convergence is the main raison d'etre of Ofcom. The idea is that these sectors are increasingly interlinked, so it makes sense to have one single body that can manage the trade-offs of policy in one sector versus the other. So convergence has positive implications and negative implications. There's more services on single devices, on single platforms, and different platforms competing for the provision of the same services. So there's greater competition in the sector because, for example, TV services can be now provided over the internet, over satellite, not just over free-to-air TV. But things also get more complex for consumers. It can be a bit messy. It can be difficult to shop around. So consumer information becomes a quite important part of what the regulator should do. Overall, Ofcom thinks that convergence is a good thing, and this is why the vision, let's call it like that, is regulating for convergence rather than against convergence. So everything we do is aims at maximizing the benefits of convergence and minimizing the costs of it. These are four main strategic objectives that we seek, that Ofcom seeks to achieve when they do regulate the sector. There's very different things in here. There's promoting competition and innovation. This is the standard economic regulation objective that all economic regulators have or tend to have. Innovation is an important part of the communication sector, which is a rather innovative sector. But it's not just about that. It's also about protecting consumers, empowering them, giving them the information so that they can effectively shop around and switch among services and stuff like that. There are also public interest objectives to look at. This is the citizen sphere as opposed to the communication sphere. And then there's also the management of the radio spectrum, which we're looking after. So these are broad, very broad objectives. There's lots of things under each of these. There's like public service broadcasting in here. What should the BBC do? What should the other broadcasters do? But there's also, for example, are communication services available to all consumers, and are prices affordable enough? So, yeah. Yeah, sorry. These slides will be available, as will be a number of sources that are all available on the internet. I'm making reference throughout the presentation to various sources. They're all publicly available. Most of them are Ofcom documents. I'm going to send you the links for all of them. Now, how does Ofcom regulate? These are high-level regulatory principles. We tend to do consultations. We cannot decide things on our own, even though we would like to sometimes. We have to consult stakeholders, so-called stakeholders, and this includes both consumers and the companies that are affected by regulation. So whenever we produce a document, we publish it, we ask people, whoever wants to contribute can, and respond to our consultation, and then after a while, we reach a final decision, taking into consideration what stakeholders think. We like to think we are evidence-based and transparent. The idea is that if you root your policies in evidence, they will be more proportionate, consistent, and just better. This is a strong claim. I mean, Ofcom struggles sometimes to be evidence-based because sometimes you just have to make a call. Evidence is not always definitive on what you should or shouldn't do. There's a bias against intervention. The idea here is that if you want to minimize the unintended consequences of regulation. If markets function, you should leave them as they are without interfering too much. But if there's something to fix, then you want to fix it in a targeted and well-thought-through way. So there's also firm intervention where required, and broadband is a case of this kind. Now, let's talk about broadband. Who has a broadband connection at home? Everyone? Almost everyone? Who doesn't? Okay, a few of you. Who used to have broadband 3 years ago? Same set of people? Sort of? 5 years ago? 7? Okay, so what's the story here? Take up. This is UK data. There's now 17 million connections, broadband connections in the UK. Please.
For broadband, we need also wireless connection or only cable connection?
Yeah,
Like 3G or
of course. I'm talking mainly about fixed, because fixed markets are those that have to be regulated more heavily for reasons I'm going to explain, but I'm also touching upon mobile broadband. This data does not include mobile broadband, but I'm going to show you more data which does include mobile broadband. Mobile broadband is a relatively recent development of the last couple of years, and it's growing fast. And it's interesting what happens to fixed broadband as a result of this. So we'll touch upon that. Broadband in general should be both, if you want to be technology neutral. Okay. So yeah, strong take-up in the UK, unsurprisingly, for a number of reasons. And the same happens in a number of countries. This is a benchmark for G7 countries. So you can see that all countries have experienced a very strong growth. Some of them have grown more quickly than others. The UK was quite behind the curve in 2002, 2003, but has now caught up with Canada, who used to have a much higher level of penetration in the early days. Italy, unfortunately, is a bit behind the curve amongst G7 countries. Penetration of broadband varies a lot across different countries. This is OECD data. You can sort of see three groups of countries. The leaders, which are mostly Northern European countries, and Korea, which has a very strong industrial policy on communications, tend to have very high penetration levels. Then there's the major economies tend to be in the middle of the league table, and then there are the laggards, which include a number of other OECD countries which are a bit lagging behind, but are catching up fast. Some of them aren't. So, how has penetration evolved over time? This graph shows penetration of a number of communication services. There's fixed telephony, mobile telephony, which overtook fixed telephony a couple of years ago. More people have a mobile phone than a fixed one these days. Then these internet connections have grown steadily, but most of this growth was driven by broadband, which has increasingly substituted for narrowband, and now almost all internet connections are of a broadband type. These numbers indicate household penetration, which are different from the numbers on the previous slide, which indicate penetration per inhabitant. So this is telling us that 65% of UK houses have a broadband connection of some kind. As you can see here, we have just one data point for mobile broadband. We just started to track it because it's a relatively new service, and there's quite a lot of controversy around that number because it's quite unclear whether mobile broadband is a complement or a substitute for fixed broadband. Early evidence would seem to suggest that it's mostly a complement, but not for everyone, and I'm going to show you some more data later on about this. So fixed broadband only penetration would be at 72, and we estimate that a further 3% this year is due to mobile broadband only. The internet is increasingly central to our lives for a number of reasons. This is home use only of communication services and how it has changed over the past 5 years. Internet services have grown fast and much faster than all the others, but television is still the key thing when it comes to relaxing at home, and it's remained very, very resilient despite all the changes that have occurred in television. Radio is suffering a bit, and fixed is suffering because, almost entirely because mobile telephony is growing a lot. So still a long way to go, but consider that this is just home use. So it doesn't count, it doesn't consider what people tend to do at work in the office. And in the office, people tend to use the internet and not to watch TV. So there are other sets of data which actually say that overall, during a day, the internet consumption is actually higher than the TV consumption. And you can do lots of stuff with the internet. That's why broadband is so popular. This is showing, I'm going to send you these slides. I'm not going to go through the detail of this. But this shows that there are a number of multimedia activities that can be done over the internet, as you well know. And there are also big variations across age groups on who does what when using broadband. Young people tend to go for broadband much more than old people. But things are changing a bit in this respect. Now, let's have a look at the market. Retail broadband tends to be competitive. This is UK data again. What does it mean? It means that prices are falling and have fallen quite significantly over the last few years. These are estimates. Don't take them as absolute truth, because it's quite hard to, especially when you buy bundles, so you buy telephony and broadband together, it's quite hard to assign revenues to one service rather than the other. But what has happened in the last few years is that the market structure in the UK is evolving a bit. So consolidation is driving up market concentration. As you can see, this is the market share of the 5 biggest players in the market, which has gone up over the last couple of years. And this was driven by mergers and acquisitions mostly. We're going to see in the following slide why this is happening. So there's 4 key players in the UK. There's British Telecom, the incumbent, so the historic telecom operator. There's Virgin Media, which is a cable operator. Cable broadband is present in some countries, in others it isn't. There's no cable broadband here in Italy, but in many European countries they do have cable broadband. And then there's 2 big players that are accessing BT's network and use it to provide services to end consumers. And the reason why they're able to do this is because of regulation, because we regulate access to BT's infrastructure. And there's a very high number of smaller providers. So as I said, the early phase of broadband have driven market fragmentation. More and more market share was taken up by BT's competitors rather than BT itself. But now things are changing because the market is maturing. How can we say that the market is maturing? Well, because new customers, the number of new customers tends to go down. It looks like we're approaching market saturation, even though almost 35% of people in the UK still do not take up broadband. The number is going down, and it looks like we are approaching a ceiling. And if we want to higher this ceiling, something should be done at a public policy level, probably. So new additions for fixed broadband are decreasing. Mobile broadband is increasing pressure on fixed broadband providers, although, as I said earlier, it's not very clear whether there's substitution or complementarity between the two. This is data that shows, I'm sorry, you probably cannot see it very well, but it's basically showing that 1/4 of mobile broadband connections are taken up by people that do not have a fixed connection. But then things tend to vary a lot across different type of households, and in particular students who are renting accommodation tend to take up mobile broadband rather than fixed broadband because it's more flexible and just easier to take it. So how do you effectively compete if you're a broadband provider today? You try and exploit economies of scale. Economies of scale are very, very important. This is a scale game, so that you can minimize costs across a growing number of subscribers. You try and offer bundles, more services to the same customers. This is because customers tend to stay with you longer, also because it's a bit harder to switch providers if you're taking, say, TV, telephony, and broadband together from the same provider. You try and leverage your brand if you have a strong brand. These days, all the new customers tend to go either to Sky or BT. Sky offers broadband in the UK. And this is mostly because as you enter into the last few segments of customers, those that know very little perhaps about technology, about computers and stuff, tend to go for the trusted brand. So that becomes a very, very important part of your selling proposition. Or, in order to compete more effectively, you have to invest in new technologies. But we're going to talk about that later. Now, regulation for broadband. Why do you have to regulate broadband? Fixed telecoms, in particular, has been a monopoly historically during the 20th century. There used to be one single provider, Telecom Italia, or SIP, it used to be called in Italy, British Telecom in the UK, France Telecom in France, and so on. But in the mid-90s, there's been a switch to liberalizing the sector. In order to effectively liberalize the sector, you have to allow entry in the market. And in order to allow entry, you have to regulate access to the infrastructure. This is because the telecoms infrastructure, the wires that go into every home, are very, very hard to replicate. There needs to be a massive, huge investment. You have to dig up every street in order to, put a wire into every house. So the idea is that you have to regulate the infrastructure if there's market failure. Now, regulation usually applies ex post. So after you see market failure, then you decide to intervene. But in the case of telecoms, the European framework allows to apply regulation ex ante, so before market failure actually happens. And in order to do this, you have to do a market review, and you have to examine whether these three conditions are met. The three conditions are high barriers to entry. The market does not tend towards competition over time. Here you have to make a call whether you think competition will arise in the market if you don't do anything or not. And ex post application of competition law is insufficient. So after you do ex post regulation, you can do ex ante regulation. What happens with broadband is that broadband at the wholesale level tends to fulfill these criteria, not at the retail level. So what regulation does is that it fixes the relations between how companies trade wholesale products amongst them, and wholesale inputs are then used to provide retail products to the end customers. So what regulation does is to create regulated products that usually grant access to the fixed infrastructure to competitors at regulated prices. So regulators tend to fix the prices of the non-replicable and essential inputs for competitors to be able to compete on retail markets. Yeah.
Two things actually. The first one is how is Virgin Media competing in the UK, since I understand that it doesn't rent network from BT, but it has its own network.
Yeah.
This is the first question. The second question, a bit provocative, is what if this is the situation of broadband regulation, what is the incentive of building up a brand new network if you have regulated prices that give you the access to the existing one?
Okay. First question. Virgin Media is a cable operator and has its own infrastructure. The history goes like this. In the 80s, there's been a strong public policy push by the Conservative government to build cable TV networks. So cable is coming from a TV relay background. So the idea was that in some places of the UK there was bad reception. And in order to fix reception of TV, you had to build a cable infrastructure. Then when the Conservative government decided to privatize BT in '84, they also decided that in order to push competition to BT, you had to give tax breaks to new entrants that were willing to build a completely new infrastructure. So the infrastructure was built during the 80s and the 90s in a slightly different way from what the standard telecoms infrastructure is, and this gives them today a huge advantage in terms of next generation broadband. So it's a separate infrastructure, but these days there is no political willingness to basically fund new networks being built. One should also say that almost all the cable providers that emerged during the 80s and 90s have gone bankrupt because of huge debt. And a process of consolidation has happened in the cable sector. Now there's just one big cable provider, burdened by debt, very high leverage, but in terms of performance, it hasn't yet managed to turn a profit, although it has a pretty good outlook for the future. And the second question was, what's the incentive of investing if you regulate prices? This is precisely why regulation for new kinds of broadband has to be changed or adapt, because the incentives to invest can be severely affected if regulation is too heavy. And I'm gonna touch on that later on. So the rationale for regulated broadband was built around the ladder of investment. There's absent regulation, there's two basic ways in which competitors can compete with the incumbent. One is to basically resell exactly the same services that the incumbent provides, and the other is to build their own infrastructure. However, if you just resell services, there's no product differentiation. So, what's the point of having resellers of the same service? There's no incentives to innovate and no incentive to lower prices. Whereas having separate infrastructure, fully vertically integrated, it would be great in an ideal world, but it's very hard for new entrants to come in and build a brand new infrastructure from scratch. So what regulation does is to create two artificial steps between these two extremes, which we call active access and passive access. Now, it gets a bit techy, but I'll try to make it simple. Active access is about having access to, let's take BT as the incumbent in this case. Competitors using active access have access to BT's electronics, and they buy access to the infrastructure which is managed by BT. So active because active electronics are still managed by BT. whereas passive access is about renting effectively just the wires, the cables, the physical infrastructure. So competitors using passive access have to invest in their own electronics, but in this way they're able to differentiate their offering more than they would be able to if they were using just active access. So you need to have both steps because active access is good to minimize upfront investment by competitors. So competitors can come in and then hopefully one day decide to invest in their own network electronics, and then eventually, in an ideal world, they would invest also in their own infrastructure. Whereas passive access is better because you have greater scope for differentiation and innovation, but there's also greater relevance of economies of scale. So it's harder to, if you start from here, it's harder just to jump there. That's why you create this intermediary step. Now
I'm just wondering, it's also a technical question, but let's say, I don't know, the whole infrastructure is like, I don't know, 100 billion or something. Of what kind of amount would you be talking for the passive access? Is there a certain ratio between?
Yeah. Passive access with today's broadband, and here I'm talking mainly about DSL, the investment needed is around 50 to 100 pounds per customer passed. So big investment, but manageable. I mean, if you make your customers pay 20 pounds a month, you kind of recoup your investment pretty quickly. Now, of course, not all the customers you cover in terms of infrastructure will buy services from you. So there's just a ratio of those. But generally, the time it takes in order to recoup investment in passive access in DSL is 3 years, more or less. So passive access was a pretty good option for entrants that were looking to enter the market 3 or 4 years ago, let's say. And Ofcom has pushed a lot and many regulators have pushed for this to be the main mode of competition in the sector because it was maximizing scope for differentiation and innovation, but it was also manageable from a financial point of view for new entrants. Now, is regulating products and prices enough? Maybe, maybe not, because a vertically integrated incumbent still has an incentive to discriminate between its own retail division and competitors' retail division. So there are also information asymmetries because the regulator doesn't really know what goes on inside BT, say, unless it has, very exhaustive information about their business practices. And then unfair behavior can take place even in presence of regulated prices. I mean, charging a different price is not the only way in which one could discriminate its competitors, but for example, the time it takes in order for the provision of new services, say. If BT was to design a new broadband service, it could, let's say, sell it to its own retail division in a week, but it could tell competitors that it takes 3 months in order to design it for them. So how do you fix that? You can do different things. In order to fix vertical integration, you have to sort of separate wholesale and retail activities inside an incumbent. There are 3 different degrees of how far you want to go. There's accounting separation, so there's a separation of the accounts for the wholesale division and the retail division. So you sort of see the flows of money from one to the other, and you can sort of monitor better what the incumbent does with its money. It's very easy to implement. It achieves greater transparency of what happens inside BT, say. But non-price related discrimination can still take place. And information asymmetries are still there to some extent. So the next step is to actually tell your incumbent that they should put their wholesale activities in a separate division of the same company. The management of this division should be separate. The information system of this division should be separate. So if effectively implemented, it ensures non-discrimination. But on the other hand, there needs to be a very strong behavioral control by the regulator. You need to ensure that the separate division is really managed in a separate way. The more radical solution is structural separation. Structural separation tends to happen in other sectors, like rail, for example, was structurally separated in the UK a few years ago. The network is now managed by separate companies, and the trains are managed by a number of different companies. So the pro here is that, you know, it's separate companies, so the wholesale company wants to maximize its own profits, so wants to maximize the customers it has. But the cons is that it's very costly to implement, and it's a way of no return. It's very hard to go back if you decide that structural separation is actually not the best thing to do. In the UK, Ofcom has implemented functional separation, so the second of these three options in 2005. Ofcom conducted a big strategic reviews in telecoms, which was focusing on broadband mostly. It defined three principles it wanted to achieve from regulation of broadband. Contestability, which is basically allowing the others to enter the market so that there's a constant threat of entry, even though there's no real entry, but there could be entry in the market. Innovation, so enhance consumer benefits by innovation, and equivalence, which means that the retail division of the incumbent should have access to exactly the same inputs as competitors. But reviewing what was happening in the UK market, it also found out that BT performance had been very, very poor, and discriminatory behavior had been in place for years. So there was a threat of implementing structural separation, but BT said, oh, wait a second, we're going to do functional separation for you, and we're going to ensure that things are done properly. So BT submitted what they're called, in a legalistic term, some undertakings. So basically, they committed to the creation of a separate division, which is called OpenReach, and which works. Let's see why. Now, before implementing functional separation in the UK, broadband growth was driven mainly by the green boxes here, which is active access. So active access was already regulated, and competitors were using it, but they were not using passive access instead, which we said it's better for service differentiation and innovation. After the implementation of functional separation here at the end of 2005, growth in broadband services has been driven by passive access mostly. So this box here has become bigger and bigger. So there's been more investment in the sector, greater plurality of provision, lower prices, greater choice. Great.
When you talk about plurality of provision,
Well, greater choice, let's say, for customers.
in terms of product, service differentiation, these kind of things. Because in
Yeah.
the end, I mean, you know, the story you told, it all comes back to BT, you know, central board and trying to control somehow
Yeah.
both the retailer and
Yeah.
wholesaler.
Yeah.
Part of the national provision, but yeah.
Of course. And what we've seen over the last few years is that many competitors have switched from active access to passive access, so the number of connections using active access has gone down. What's the result? The result is that there's passive access competitors offering services to about 80% of the UK, mostly in urban areas. This is because the economies of networks are much easier to manage in urban areas because there's greater concentration. But as a result, about 70% of households in the UK have a choice of at least 4 providers, 4 different broadband providers. What this implies is that once you regulate upstream markets in an effective way, you can remove regulation from downstream markets. So what Ofcom has done is that Ofcom defined geographic markets, and where there were 4 or more providers of active access, of passive access, sorry, active access was not going to be regulated anymore. So the idea is that if you find in your value chain the bottleneck and you're able to fix that bottleneck, in theory, everything that happens downstream of that bottleneck should sort of fix itself, in theory. Now, recently, as a consequence of implementing functional separation, Ofcom has also completely deregulated retail telephony that used to be regulated. It's a slightly different story, but it's somehow related to this one. Now, superfast broadband. So what is superfast broadband? How do you define it? It's about better, faster services which are significantly different from today's. Some people tend to say that superfast broadband should be, say, 100 megabits, for example, per second for each customer. Ofcom tends to be technology neutral, so we don't say that superfast broadband has to achieve a certain speed and has to be delivered by a certain technology, although it's mostly around fiber connections, but not only, because some customers could, for example, value more the benefits of mobility and prefer to use next generation mobile technologies rather than fixed technologies. So you can deliver superfast broadband via a range of different technologies. There's cable, there's wireless, 3G, 4G, but the focus of regulation is on the fixed network, is on the incumbents network, because it's the most heavily regulated part of the sector. And if you want the incumbent to invest, and if you want to maintain competition in the sector, you sort of have to think about how to change things. So this is where regulation focuses. The definition is very loose. I know it would be just easier to say anything above 50 megabits per second is superfast broadband, but because of this technology neutrality issue, Ofcom tends to not to define services in a too strict way. There are pros and cons to this. Please.
Is there a policy that Ofcom has towards fiber? Are you like lobbying for fiber to every home, or I want to know how it's going to be in the future?
Yeah, I'm gonna touch on that, but just to clarify, Ofcom does not tend to set targets for the economy. Targets are something that should be done by governments because it's an industrial policy aim, an industrial policy area. Regulators do regulation, do not tend to do industrial policy. But, you know, the distinction between these two is very, you know, yeah, it is vague. How can I explain it? Well, Ofcom has defined duties which do not include, you know, setting targets for the economy. The government does that, and recently, actually, the UK government had a big review of the digital communications sector called Digital Britain. They decided not to set targets for fiber broadband, but they did decide to encourage universal availability of standard broadband, for example. But that's a decision that the government takes, and then it's down to Ofcom to implement this decision. Is that a bit clearer?
So the decision that UK government is not to pursue just fiber?
Not really, no. The government said it is likely that the market will deliver fiber to a significant proportion of UK households. Sorry?
It's not a government department.
No. But other governments have decided to actually directly invest and put the money. Australia. I'm gonna touch on it later on. So there's a variety of approaches across countries. The UK government tends to be, you know, tends to have a market-based approach, which says if the market can invest and can deliver, let's let the market do its own thing. And once the market stops, we can sort of fix the remaining areas of the UK where there's no fiber. This is the theory. The practice is that the government has no money, basically, because it paid out the banks. but don't tell people I said this. Okay. Please.
And what are you going to talk about Superfast more now? Or
Yeah.
okay, also about the demand?
Yeah. I'm going to say, well, the demand. I'm going to say that demand is very uncertain. But if you have a question on that, we can discuss it later. Now, why is Superfast broadband important? Because it allows the delivery of a number of new applications. So HD TV via fiber connections is the typical example, video conferencing, even 3D TV. But probably the most important thing is the multiple usage of different things across the household. I live in a shared flat, and if my flatmates are downloading from Emule or BitTorrent, I cannot call my mom on Skype. I mean, you know, these are important things, given that I've got to speak to my mom every day. But, you know, it's not just about raw speed. It's also about greater resilience and, you know, product performance levels. So there are a number of benefits that could flow through the economy if there was fiber everywhere. You can do more of the same, better services, or even you could provide customers with new services like entertainment services or video conferencing. It would be better for citizens as well. So in terms of social policy, it could allow greater inclusion, greater participation to the democratic process and stuff like that. For businesses, it would be better for them because they would have more resilient connection. Fiber connections tend to be much more reliable than copper-based connections. And it could also support new business models built around the delivery of services via very fast networks. And in the wider economy and society, here it gets fluffier and fluffier, but in theory, there could be more remote working, so reduced carbon emissions, so it would be better even for the environment. So it would be good to have it, and to have it soon. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that there are huge costs involved. Now, if we look at the fixed network, the way in which DSL connections are provided today are according to this mode. So imagine that this is a tree and branch architecture. So there's a core network. In each city, there's a node. The node feeds fiber links to local exchanges in local areas. And from this sort of big box, there are, let's say, 1,000 copper connections coming out of it and going straight into the homes. If you want to deliver faster services, you need to substitute copper with fiber. You can do it for just one portion of the access network and rely on copper for the remaining portion. This is called fiber to the cabinet. And you can use what's called VDSL from here on. Or you can go all the way to the home, please. It still depends on the line length of this bit here. You may know that these DSL technologies, the performance of DSL technologies is very much dependent upon the length of the line. So if you live very close to a cabinet, you can get even 100 megabits. But on average, it's about 40, 50 megabits, or even less than that. BT has released confidential data about the speed they are actually achieving in their trials, and it's a bit underwhelming, actually, because it is still using copper in the last portion, so it's still highly variable. This is the best solution in terms of performance, but it's very expensive. Now, I said earlier that the cost of doing passive access in DSL is around 50 to 100 pounds per home passed. If you were to do fiber to the cabinet, so the second mode in that previous slide, you would look at something between 300 and 500 pounds per home. And if you want to do fiber to the home, it's above 1,000 pounds per home. So massive investment, huge. The reason is that you have to basically dig up the streets. There are ways in which you can sort of lower costs, for example, using overhead cables. In Japan, there's lots and lots of overhead cables going to every house. Now, in European countries that tend to be a bit stricter in terms of regulating what can be put from one house to the other up in the air. But the government is easing regulations so that sort of deployment of fiber can happen in a cheaper way. So on the one hand, you have huge costs. On the other, you have your revenues from broadband decreasing and decreasing because of competition and because it is becoming increasingly a commodity. So why would you invest then? Would you? And if so, why? Okay. Can you?
There's money to be made there in the future for sure.
Okay. So.
That's if to invest it when. That's the question.
Okay. Okay. Any other idea? Yeah.
Well, I would invest as well, but I would just discriminate between metropolitan areas where I can get a lot of revenues with relatively little investment, and I mean rural areas. I mean, you probably as a regulatory body, you would impose on me that I have to access those areas as well, but I wouldn't want to do that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Anyone else? Okay. So there are three drivers for investment mainly. One is new revenues. In future, there will be new services delivered with broadband, and if you're able to monetize them, then you get more money. So it may take a while, maybe 10, 15 years, but eventually you will recoup your investment. Problem is that demand, it's a chicken and egg problem. Until you deliver those services, you cannot really know what the demand is. Willingness to pay research tends to be not very reliable, because if you ask somebody, would you pay 10 quids more for your broadband connection, they might say, yes, of course. But then when it actually comes to buying the product, things might change because the money is actually coming out of your pocket. Another driver could be just to have lower costs. Fiber technologies are more efficient, faults are much less frequent, but the problem is that until you switch all your customers to your new network, you cannot switch off the old network. So cost savings are achievable in the long term, whereas investors want to get back their money in the short term. So the key driver for investment really is competition. We've said that competing in broadband is becoming more and more difficult. So if you want to win new customers, you want to be ahead of the game. You want to be able to provide new services and have a unique offering, hopefully. So in most countries where fiber investment is taking place, competition is the key driver. Or there could be political pressures and industrial policy goals set by the government, but different governments have a different approach to this. So in Japan, for example, there are tax breaks for investment in fiber. So you can basically not pay taxes on your investment and on the revenues you get from that investment, which means that your cost is just lower. So the business case is a bit stronger. Investment in fiber is happening. It's the level of coverage is very variable across countries. As you said, the operators tend to focus on the urban areas because costs are lower. More affluent people tend to live there, so it's just easier to recoup your investment there. Lots of plans. In some countries, the coverage has been achieved already. In others, it's all about achieving it in future. And the target dates tend to vary quite a lot and tend to be quite far in the future. Now, how do you regulate broadband, superfast broadband? Should you change the regulation or not? It's a typical regulatory dilemma. On the one hand, you now have competition in the sector. It's driving consumer benefits, low costs. People are taking up broadband, so it's good. But on the other hand, you don't want to stifle your investment. So you have to balance between those two. You have to find the right regulatory approach to find the right balance. The idea is that you don't really know what will be the future returns. So So if you assume a normal distribution, you could have certain returns absent regulation and lower returns if regulation is imposed. So if you regulate too heavily, companies will invest less, and that's no good. Now, incumbents in the past few years have suggested the idea of a regulatory holiday. So this means basically giving a break to incumbents because they've got to build a new network, it's about new technologies. You shouldn't stifle innovation in new markets by regulating too heavily. So the idea is that it's an emerging market. So let us do our own thing. The response to these arguments varies a lot across countries. In the United States, there's no regulation. There's forbearance. The Americans say, we've got two networks, the telecom network and the cable network in most places in the UK. Competition between those two is enough. Two is enough in the market. So we don't need to regulate. This is historically the approach that the United States have had to telecoms regulation since 2001, so even before fiber. And what's happening in the US is that telecom companies are investing in fiber very heavily. They've been first movers mostly, but they're only investing where cable is actually competing with them. So they're investing in urban areas, affluent areas. They're not investing in rural areas. You could have industrial policy goals. Again, the Japanese case. Korea is another type of country that implements this kind of approach. They say we want to have our sort of national champion, and we want to help it invest for the benefit of the whole nation. Then Australia, as I said earlier, has actually decided, you know what, the government, I'm going to invest because this is a huge project. It's a critical national infrastructure. So I think that there should be public investment because the market will never deliver fiber to everyone in the country, so it's a matter for government. This is a huge project, which was one of the key points in the manifesto of the Labour Party before they won the election. They won the election, and now they're actually delivering it. I wish them luck because it's a project that will span over probably 10 to 15 years. It's big, it's massive. There's many things that could go wrong, but it's a very brave decision to make. And if you can, it's probably a good thing to do. The idea is that there are lots of externalities coming out of fiber. As I've said earlier, it's not just about providing new services, but it's also about greater efficiency in the overall economy. So this is the rationale for public investment. In the European Union, instead, there's a different approach to regulation. The European Commission says it took us years to achieve competition in telecoms. Now, we don't want to spoil it just because of fiber. So investing in fiber, if there was a regulatory holiday, could allow a remonopolization of the sector. So basically, if incumbents invest in fiber, they can sort of cut out of the market their competitors. Also, there's this subtle point about the fact that markets are defined by services and not by technologies. So implementing a new technology to deliver the same service means that actually the market is still the same. It's still broadband. It's faster. There could be substitutability of demand between current and future generation of broadband. So it should be sort of the same market. The idea is that regulation should be adapted to encourage investment, but it shouldn't be scrapped altogether. Yeah?
Just 2 points on this. First relates to the Australia case. It seems to me a very clear case, especially when you think in terms of population density. Again, it's probably, well, I don't know the details, but it's probably the less densely populated countries of the ones that you mentioned, which calls for a we'll see how it works. In terms of the fact that the markets are defined by the services and not by networks or technologies, fair enough. But what about vertical integration? I mean, I understand that the European Union has tried to push companies to somehow disintegrate their activities, but to me, competition seems still quite low.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe the UK is a good case for
Yeah.
that, but other countries are
Yeah.
clearly showing that the incumbents or the top two companies retain 80% of the market. So I'm not completely sure that this is really an argument.
Okay. Okay.
You know better than I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. On the Australian case, there's not just that. Of course, the geography of the country plays a huge part, but there's also the fact that the incumbent in Australia has historically been very, very stubborn and has always strongly opposed regulation. What the Australian government wanted to do was actually to encourage private bids for this project. They were saying, we're going to give you the money and you're going to do it. So why don't you submit a proposal to us so that we can sort of evaluate them, and then we're going to lend you the money. You're going to pay back in your own time, and you're going to deliver this infrastructure for us. The way in which Telstra, the Australian incumbent, replied was a bid which was 10 pages long in order to get, well, it was a lower sum than that, but it was around 20 billion Australian dollars, because they were basically saying, without us, without our network, you cannot do anything. So we have sort of the power to decide what we want to do. So that's why the Australian government then decided to actually go for full-blown public intervention, public investment. And now they're probably going to structurally separate Telstra. On the vertical integration point, there's, competitive situations across Europe vary a lot. And the European Commission is always struggling to give, consistent guidance to all countries, to all regulators, in order to achieve this utopia of the single market. But conditions across countries, vary significantly. And on the vertical integration point, some commentators are actually arguing that because of technological change, the balance of costs and benefits of vertical integration is actually changing, and there could be a case for actually allowing vertical integration because it's just more efficient to do so. This is also sort of reflected by the approach that Ofcom has chosen. Ofcom defined high-level principles 2 years ago on how it wanted to regulate for fiber. These principles were including the old principles of the previous telecom strategic review, so contestability, innovation, and equivalence. But then 2 additional principles were added in order to reflect the changed situation. One was to reflecting risk in access terms. This means that regulated prices have to be higher, basically, because the risk of investment is higher. And regulatory clarity is about being as transparent as possible about what you're going to do in future, how you're going to regulate the market so that the investors know what to expect in terms of regulation. So these principles aim at achieving the dual aim of promoting competition and securing investment. Now, after a couple of years of work, that involved me as well, Ofcom has announced how these high-level principles would translate in practice. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail. Basically, the idea is that because the costs of the investment are so high, it is very unlikely that competition based on passive access will go beyond the most dense urban areas. So in order to keep competition, you kind of have to switch towards active access, so to a lower level of vertical integration by the by the competitors. However, because of technological change, there could be a scope for defining new regulated products that would allow differentiation and innovation, although you use active access rather than passive access. So there's a recognition that the current way of regulating fixed telecoms has to change. It doesn't have to change structurally. Ofcom believes that functional separation is still valid, but the way in which prices are regulated and products are regulated has to evolve a bit. And actually, given that no one knows what the level of demand will be and what the costs really are for delivering new services, there's also the point about pricing flexibility. So Ofcom is not going to regulate prices for active products. It will regulate the fact that BT has to provide the same services it uses for its own retail division to other competitors, but we're not going to mandate a level of pricing for that because we don't know enough in order to find an efficient level of pricing. Now, we're not done yet, of course. These measures are quickly run through, basically are aimed at delivering investment to the first half of the country. Now, this is a cost curve for investing in fiber in the UK, estimates, of course. Now, if you get to 50 to 60%, the cost per household is actually quite constant. But as you go into rural areas, the unit cost gets much higher. So what we think, what also the government thinks, is that the market is quite likely to deliver, and actually there are investment plans in order to deliver fiber to, say, 50 to 60% of the UK. This is mostly cities. But after that, public policy will have to step in and sort of change the incentives if we want fiber to be delivered to a wider set of consumers. So the first phase of how regulation and policy should be designed is kind of done, but we are now thinking quite hard about how to go further than that. The government a few months ago came up with the idea of having a broadband tax, which is basically about charging everyone who's using a telephone service, not just broadband subscribers, but all telephony subscribers, with 50 cents per month, basically. So this would raise £6 a year from every telephony subscriber, and that money would then be pulled into a fund, which would basically use that money in order to give bidders money to invest in rural areas. Now, the proposal is still a bit up in the air. The government has this proposal, but they're not sure whether they want to implement a new tax before an election. But if they decide to go for it, Ofcom will have to oversee the distribution of those funds. We're not going to collect the money, but we're going to oversee the distribution. Please.
In the beginning of your presentation, you were saying that basically it's kind of difficult for you to look into these companies and estimate their cost structure, for example. But for example, with this model, it's clearly in the interest of these fiber providers or potential fiber providers to move that line in the middle to the left side, so you guys actually come with more funds to support them. So to which extent do you share your strategies with them?
Okay. Okay, there's 2 points to make. The first is that these funds are designed to start from here. So let's say the market is starting from here and public policy is starting from here, and you will sort of meet in the middle. Now, £6 a month is actually very little, and in, say, 5 to 6 years, you could start from here and sort of get here. So you're not going to get there. So there's going to be time for the market to deliver up until here. And the crucial point for the market to deliver is competition. So you have to ensure that there is still competition, there is still an incentive to invest. And the key incentive for BT these days is the fact that Virgin Media, the cable operator, is actually able to deliver 50 megabits per second to its subscribers already because of the difference in how the cable infrastructure is designed. So there's two things. One, public policy should be, the intervention of public policy is contained to those areas where there's clearly a market failure, where the market will never go, and it's quite limited. And on the other hand, you need competition in order to drive investment. Okay? Now, last 10 minutes about what happens with broadband in a recession. You all know we're going through the worst recession of the last, 50, 70 years, who knows. It's particularly hard in the UK. The UK economy is dependent on financial services, and financial services have been heavily affected by the recession. The government decided to bail out the banks, spending a huge amount of money, and now public debt is soaring, and the next government will have to cut spending and raise new taxes. So when there's a financial crisis, raising money, borrowing money becomes more difficult. Now, most of the telecoms companies are heavily geared. The ratio of debt to equity is quite high. So the days of cheap credit are over. And refinancing your debt, if you're not able to pay back your debt, you have to refinance it. And when you refinance it, you will have to pay higher interest rates because the supply of debt is just constrained. There's a nice story about Tiscali, which was close to collapsing and has now been acquired a few years before they were going to declare bankruptcy by a competitor in order to get it for cheap. So it's even more difficult to invest because it's hard to raise funds, especially when demand is so uncertain. So what's happening is that the big players have some flexibility to invest, but mainly by substituting other costs. So you stop spending in other areas. So maybe you kind of stop the maintenance of your old network. So you're probably going to end up with more faults on the old network, but you divert that money to investment. And investment is starting from the urban areas where there are the quick, easy wins, where it's less expensive and you're more likely to recoup your investment. Yeah?
What about mobile broadband? I'm not particularly into the view that you can substitute easily with mobile in rural areas and so on and so forth. But in this situation, which to me seems extremely dependent on incumbents' decision,
Yeah.
in whichever country, maybe the mobile sector might be a bit more competitive in terms of investments. I don't know about the financial situation of mobile operators in detail, but it seems to me probably a promising field.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's also a strategic choice you have to take when you regulate the sector. If you cannot have the same amount of competition within a platform, can you actually encourage competition across platforms? So maybe competition amongst fixed providers will be lower in future, but is there a way to encourage competition from mobile providers into broadband? What's happening right now is that mobile broadband based on 3G tends to increase pressures in the lower end of the market and in certain market segments. There are prospects for new technologies being deployed by mobile operators. Now, the situation in the UK is a bit complicated because it all revolves around the assignment of spectrum to different operators. And I'm not going to get into that because it's very complex, but basically the government is now trying to make a call on who should use the spectrum in order to deliver for new technologies. But certainly, in future, policy is probably going to encourage greater competition from mobile providers in order to, put some constraints to the activities of incumbents. Now, this is what happens to the supply, sort of. What happens to the demand? Are consumers likely to give up broadband or not? During a recession, you have a tighter budget, so you sort of cut spending for things that you do not consider essential. Is broadband essential or not? Now, last year I came here with a number of hypotheses and I didn't have an answer. Now this year Ofcom has done some research. We actually done surveys, commission surveys, asking people what they want to do with their money. Are they likely to give up broadband or not? And the answer is probably no. Now, this is a range of things that people buy, and those up there are those services and products that are most likely to suffer in a recession because consumers are likely to cut back their spending for going to the restaurant or doing holidays. So big spend, big discretionary spend is likely to be affected in a recession. Whereas telecom services are much more resilient for a number of reasons. They are quite important. They're relatively cheap. So you don't save a lot if you save, £10, £20 a month on broadband. And it's quite useful. You kind of depend on it, although to varying degrees. So telecom services are relatively resilient in a recession. Different type of question, proportion of consumers becoming more conscious about their spend. Across all communication services, broadband sits at the bottom of the range. Consumers are more likely to spend less in mobile, and actually now mobile operators are responding to this by giving away minutes for much less. So that now lower-end packages are becoming much more popular than higher-end packages. Whereas broadband is quite resilient. But the most interesting question to me is this one. It's how likely are you to shop around for your communication services now compared to what you were a year ago? And, just 20% of consumers say they're likely to shop around more, to get more informed and more involved into the buying decision because there's a difference between offers and packages and prices. But actually, 40% of consumers say they're not likely to shop around more. What this is telling us is that there's a sort of inertia in, it takes time and effort to shop around, get informed, find the best deal for you. And after all, it's just about, 4 or 5% of your monthly income. It's not much. Is it worth the effort or not? Now, if you had less competition in the sector, there's quite a lot of competition in broadband these days, but if in future you had less competition and you wouldn't be able to fix competition on the supply side, this is where you would have to leverage the fixing the market. You would have to fix the market on the demand side. So you would have to provide consumers with information directly, perhaps doing a comparison of packages, or giving them the tools in order to be able to make a conscious decision about what they buy. So it's about, in future, this is my personal view, in future it would be probably more about fixing this consumer inertia rather than continuously try to fix competition on the supply side, because technology is evolving and market structure are evolving with that. Regulation does play a role, but regulation cannot fix everything. But if consumers are more active, then providers have an incentive to compete more on quality and price. Yep. Yes. Yeah, but no, it's not bad, but 40% to me is quite a lot. I would have expected more people to be more active. Everyone in the UK especially is very paranoid about the recession, and the impact of the recession is very heavily felt across society. I'm not sure how things are over here, but up there it's quite a big deal.
Plus, this is time data, so probably the infection is even bigger. Because like 60% of consumers time yes, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's just a survey. Yeah. Okay. Then there's the point about what would you miss the most if you had to give up communication services. Okay, lots of numbers here, just two things. Internet is increasingly becoming important for everyone, and for young people especially. The green bars are about, I would miss a lot the internet if I had to give it up. On the other hand, there's television still, very important for most people, for the majority of them. And even for young people, it's actually pretty important. 40%, around 40% would miss it. Another interesting phenomenon not related to broadband is about music. The proportion of young people that would miss listening to music on CDs has actually become 0, because now everyone is using MP3 players. And also games consoles are becoming more and more important for young consumers, not in the 16 to 24 bracket, but more in my bracket, the 25 to 34 bracket. Okay, summary. Key messages of today: very fast growth for broadband. The market is now maturing. Market structure is changing. Consolidation is happening. Regulation has heavily influenced market evolution in some countries more than in others. It is more effectively to regulate upstream because then downstream markets should fix themselves. And you can actually remove regulation downstream if you fix upstream markets. Regulation in broadband is designed to allow competitors access to non-replicable assets. Technology is creating discontinuities. Superfast broadband is the big thing of today and tomorrow, but it's hard to invest, and competition is still very, very important to drive investment. There are very different views across countries on how regulation should be designed to support superfast broadband. And in the current economic climate, broadband tends to be resilient, and this confirms that it's actually becoming a utility. We're not quite there, but more and more people think of broadband as something essential to them. Okay, any questions? Yeah? Yeah?
For the fiber to be efficient,
Mm-hmm.
can you have pieces of the line with your technology?
No. Yeah.
So what's the point within a country like in Australia to develop this line with public funds if for any transmission which goes outside Australia is incorrect?
Sorry, for any transmission that goes outside Australia?
This is incorrect.
Well, international communications networks are all made of fiber. There's quite separate set of companies that actually lays undersea cables across the Atlantic, across the Pacific.
Those international lines have been publicly funded.
No. It's a private investment has driven it's actually a very, very competitive market, and the internet bubble in 2001 actually heavily affected financially the international operators, because between 97 and 2000 there was a lot of hype, and everyone was thinking, people are going to use the internet for everything, and we need bandwidth, and especially international bandwidth. So lots of companies started laying fiber cables undersea, especially between Europe and America. And then after 2001, there's been the market crash, and lots of those went bust. Actually, now the market is picking up again, mostly because bandwidth consumption is driven by video, YouTube and internet TV, and peer-to-peer file sharing especially are the main drivers of that. So that's actually very competitive market, and prices are going down steadily.
There's no way of making these companies somehow get into the local or national markets, right?
No, not really, because the economies are completely different. I mean, some incumbents have international operations, but what tends to happen is that the incumbents tend to club together into consortia, and they build together cables, and then other companies compete with these consortia to build alternative cables. Okay.